In the summer of 1989, three young cousins disappeared from their family's cotton farm in rural West Texas during a weekend sleepover. No bodies were ever found. No suspects were ever named. For 35 years, their vanishing remained one of Texas's most haunting unsolved mysteries. But when a construction crew breaks ground on that same property in 2024, they unearth something that suggests the children never left the farm at all. And what they find raises a question more terrifying than their disappearance. If the cousins were here all along, who or what kept them hidden? If you're drawn to true mysteries that defy explanation, subscribe. The backhoe's metal teeth bit into the red Texas clay with a grinding shriek that echoed across the empty field. Ray Martinez had been operating heavy machinery for 23 years, and he'd learned to read the earth like some men read books. He knew when the ground would give easily and when it would fight back. He knew the difference between rock and root, between settled soil and disturbed ground. What he didn't know, as he guided the backhoe across the northeastern corner of the old Hartley property on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, was that he was about to uncover something that would reopen a case the local sheriff's department had closed decades ago. The land had been sold 6 months prior to a development company planning to build a small subdivision of ranch-style homes. The Hartley family had finally let it go after holding onto it through bankruptcy, drought, and a scandal that had never quite faded from local memory. The cotton farm had sat empty since 1995, the main house demolished in 2008, leaving only the barn and a few outbuildings that had slowly collapsed under the weight of time and neglect. Ray was clearing the field for the foundation work when he felt the backhoe's bucket catch on something solid about 4 feet down. He'd hit plenty of rocks before, but this felt different. The resistance was wrong, somehow. He reversed the machine and tried again at a slightly different angle. The bucket scraped against something that definitely wasn't stone. He shut off the engine and climbed down to investigate. The morning sun was already fierce, and sweat darkened his shirt as he dropped into the shallow excavation. Using his hands, he brushed away loose dirt from whatever had caught his bucket. His fingers touched smooth, curved fiberglass. He worked faster now, clearing away more earth until he could see what he'd found. A large septic tank, old and corroded, but not empty. Through a crack in the top that his backhoe had opened, he could see something inside, something wrapped in what looked like deteriorating fabric. Ray pulled out his phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. He'd lived in Mercer County his entire life. He'd been 17 in 1989 when those 3 kids vanished. Everyone remembered. Everyone wondered. And now, standing in the red dirt of the Hartley farm, Ray Martinez realized he might finally have the answer. When the police arrived 40 minutes later, they would spend the rest of the day carefully excavating the septic tank. By evening, the medical examiner would confirm what Ray had suspected the moment he saw the wrapped forms in the darkness below. They had found the Hartley cousins. And they had been here, buried in the ground, for 35 years. The call came to Detective Sarah Chen's desk at 3:47 in the afternoon, just as she was preparing to leave for her daughter's piano recital. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Marcus Webb, and his words made her sink slowly back into her chair. "We found them, Sarah. The Hartley children. They were on the property the whole time." Sarah closed her eyes, processing this information. She'd only been with the Mercer County Sheriff's Department for 8 years, but she'd inherited the cold case files, and the Hartley disappearance had haunted her since the first time she'd read through the yellowed reports. 3 children, gone without a trace. No leads, no suspects, no resolution. "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her keys. The drive to the Hartley property took 30 minutes. Though she barely registered the passing landscape. Her mind was already sorting through what she remembered from the case files. Emma Hartley, age 10. Jacob Hartley, age 9. Sophie Hartley, age 7. First cousins who'd been inseparable. They'd vanished on the night of August 12, 1989, during what was supposed to be a fun weekend sleepover at Emma's house on the farm. When Sarah arrived at the property, she counted 7 patrol cars, 2 ambulances, the medical examiner's van, and a crime scene unit already setting up portable lights around the excavation site. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. Sheriff Webb met her at the perimeter tape, his weathered face grave. He was 63 years old and had been a deputy when the children first disappeared. This case had defined much of his career. Ray Martinez was doing site prep for a housing development, Webb explained, leading her toward the excavation. His backhoe cracked open an old septic tank about 4 feet down. At first, he thought he'd just damaged some old infrastructure. Then he looked inside. They stopped at the edge of the excavation. Crime scene techs in white suits were carefully working around a large fiberglass tank that had been partially unearthed. The tank was roughly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, its surface pitted with age and corrosion. A section of the top had been broken away by the backhoe, creating a jagged opening. "They're still in there?" Sarah asked quietly. Webb nodded. Medical examiner wanted everything documented before removal. "But Sarah, there's something else you need to know." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The bodies were wrapped in plastic sheeting and tied with rope. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate." Sarah felt a chill despite the heat. "Who owned this property in 1989? "Thomas and Patricia Hartley, Emma's parents. They're both deceased now. Thomas died in a car accident in 1993, Patricia from cancer in 2002. They maintained until their deaths that they had no idea what happened to the children." "What about the other parents, Jacob and Sophie's? Margaret and David Hartley, Thomas's brother and sister-in-law. They moved to Oklahoma in 1991. Last I heard, they were still alive." Webb pulled out a small notebook. "I've already put in calls to the Oklahoma authorities to make contact." Sarah watched as the medical examiner, Dr. Raymond Foster, emerged from the excavation. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses that caught the fading sunlight. He pulled down his mask as he approached them. "It's definitely 3 juvenile remains," he confirmed. "Based on the size and the way they're positioned, I'd estimate they were placed here shortly after death. The plastic wrapping and the sealed environment of the septic tank preserved some soft tissue, which might help with DNA confirmation." "How long until we have positive identification?" Sarah asked. "Rush the DNA. We might have preliminary results in 48 hours. I'll need dental records for comparison if they're available." He glanced back at the excavation. "But detective, there's something you should see before we move them." Sarah followed Dr. Foster to the edge of the pit, where a tech was photographing the interior of the tank. Through the broken opening, she could see 3 small forms wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, bound tightly with rope. They were positioned side by side, almost carefully arranged. "Look at their heads," Dr. Foster said, pointing. Sarah leaned closer, her stomach tightening. Through the translucent plastic, she could make out the shape of small skulls, and on each one, visible even through the wrapping, was what appeared to be a cloth bag pulled over the head. "They were suffocated," Dr. Foster said quietly. "Bags tied around their necks, then wrapped and buried together. This was methodical, planned." Sarah stepped back from the excavation, her mind racing. 35 years ago, someone had murdered 3 children and buried them in a septic tank on their own family's property. The most obvious suspects would have been the adults who lived on the farm. But Thomas and Patricia Hartley had been thoroughly investigated at the time and never charged. "We need to reopen everything," she said, turning to Webb. "Every interview, every lead, every person who was on this property that weekend, something was missed the first time around." Webb nodded grimly. "I'll have the case files brought up from archives tonight. But Sarah, you need to understand something. This case nearly destroyed this community the first time. When those kids vanished, suspicion fell on everyone. Neighbors turned against each other. Families were torn apart. And now, we're about to do it all over again." "The difference is," Sarah said, watching as the techs began the delicate process of extracting the wrapped bodies from the septic tank. "This time, we have evidence. This time, we have victims. And this time, We're going to find out who did this." As the sun finally slipped below the horizon and the portable lights clicked on, bathing the excavation in harsh white light, Sarah Chen made a silent promise to 3 children who had been lying in the dark for 35 years. She would find the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. The Mercer County Sheriff's Department headquarters had been quiet when Sarah arrived at 7 the next morning, but by 8 o'clock the parking lot was full and reporters had begun gathering at the entrance. News of the discovery had spread overnight, and the small Texas town of Brennan was once again at the center of a media storm. Sarah sat in the conference room surrounded by boxes of case files that had been pulled from the archives. The manila folders were faded with age, their edges soft from handling. She'd been reading for an hour, and with each page, the tragedy of 1989 became more real. The children had arrived at the Hartley farm on Friday, August 11th, 1989. It was supposed to be a weekend of summer fun before school started. Emma Hartley had begged her parents to let her cousins come stay, and Thomas and Patricia had agreed. Margaret and David Hartley had driven Jacob and Sophie down from Dallas, planning to pick them up on Sunday evening. The last confirmed sighting of all 3 children alive was Saturday evening at approximately 8:30 p.m. when Patricia Hartley had brought them cookies and milk in Emma's bedroom. Patricia had told investigators that the children were playing a board game and seemed happy. She'd kissed Emma goodnight, told the cousins to sleep well, and gone back downstairs. Sunday morning, when Patricia went to wake them for breakfast, all 3 children were gone. Their beds were rumpled but empty. Emma's bedroom window was open, the screen removed and leaning against the outside wall. The children's shoes were missing, but their overnight bags remained in the room. Thomas and Patricia had immediately searched the property, thinking the children had woken early and gone exploring. The farm covered 200 acres, with plenty of places for adventurous kids to wander. After 2 hours of searching, Thomas had called the police. The initial investigation had been extensive. Dogs tracked the children's scent from Emma's bedroom window to a gravel road about half a mile from the house, then lost the trail. Investigators theorized the children had been picked up by a vehicle at that point. Every sex offender within 100 miles was investigated. Thomas and Patricia's finances were examined for any sign of ransom demands or suspicious transactions. Margaret and David were questioned repeatedly about their marriage, their relationship with Thomas and Patricia, any family conflicts. Nothing had yielded results. The children had simply vanished, and for 35 years, their disappearance had remained a mystery. Until yesterday. Sarah looked up as Sheriff Webb entered the conference room carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her and took a seat across the table. "DNA rush is processing," he said. "Dr. Foster is confident on preliminary visual identification based on age and physical characteristics, but he wants confirmation before we notify next of kin." "Tell me about the family dynamics in 1989, Sarah said, closing the file in front of her. "What was the relationship like between Thomas and his brother David?" Webb took a long sip of coffee before answering. "Complicated. Thomas was older by 5 years. He'd inherited the farm from their father, which caused some resentment. David had moved to Dallas, worked in insurance, made decent money, but there was always this tension about the farm. David felt he deserved a share of it. Enough to kill over? I was a deputy back then, so I wasn't privy to all the details. But I remember David being thoroughly investigated. He and Margaret had an alibi. They were at a company dinner in Dallas Saturday night with about 50 witnesses." Sarah made a note. "What about Patricia? What was she like?" Webb's expression grew thoughtful. "Patricia was quiet, very religious, very devoted to Emma. She fell apart after the disappearance. I remember going out to the farm a few months later for a follow-up, and she was like a ghost, just wandering through the house. Emma's room left exactly as it had been that morning. And Thomas was harder to read. He was angry, defensive, cooperative with the investigation, but always with this edge to him, like he resented being questioned at all. He'd built that farm up from nothing after his father died, worked himself to the bone, Some folks thought he was too controlled, too unemotional about losing his daughter, but grief looks different on different people. Sarah pulled out another file, this one containing interview transcripts. Who else was on the property that weekend? Just Thomas and Patricia in the main house. But there were two farmhands who lived in the bunkhouse about a quarter-mile from the main residence. Clayton Wade and Raymond Price. Both were interviewed extensively. Where are they now? Webb's face darkened. Clayton Wade died in prison in 2003. He was convicted of assaulting a minor in 1995. Different case, different victim. But it always made me wonder. Raymond Price is still around, actually. Lives in town, works at the hardware store. He's in his 60s now. Sarah felt a surge of interest. Clayton Wade had a history with children. Not until after the Hartley case. His conviction was for assaulting his girlfriend's 12-year-old daughter. But Sarah, he was investigated for the Hartley disappearance. He passed a polygraph. His alibi, checked out. He'd been in town Saturday night at a bar, came back to the bunkhouse around midnight. Raymond confirmed it. Polygraphs aren't foolproof, and alibis can be fabricated, especially between friends. Webb nodded slowly. I know. And now that we've found the bodies on the property, we have to reconsider everything. A knock on the conference room door interrupted them. A young officer poked his head in. Detective Chen, we've got someone in the lobby asking to speak with you. Says she has information about the Hartley case. Sarah exchanged glances with Webb, then stood. Who is it? She says her name is Rachel Price. Says her father was Raymond Price, one of the farmhands. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Bring her to interview room 2. Sheriff, would you join me? As they walked down the corridor, Sarah's mind was already working through possibilities. Why would Raymond Price's daughter come forward now, after 35 years? What information could she possibly have that hadn't already been shared with investigators? Interview room 2 was small and windowless, furnished with only a table and 4 chairs. Sarah and Webb entered to find a woman in her early 40s waiting for them. She had shoulder-length brown hair and wore jeans and a faded blue sweater despite the Texas heat. Her hands were clasped tightly on the table in front of her, and Sarah noticed immediately that they were shaking. Miss Price, Sarah said, taking a seat across from her. I'm Detective Chen, and this is Sheriff Webb. We understand you have information about the Hartley case? Rachel Price looked between them, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was 9 years old in 1989, she said. I lived with my mother in town, but I used to visit my father at the farm on weekends sometimes. I was there that weekend. The weekend the cousins disappeared. She paused, swallowing hard. I saw something that night, something I've been too scared to talk about for 35 years. But now that they've found those poor children, I can't stay quiet anymore. Sarah leaned forward, keeping her voice gentle. What did you see, Rachel? Rachel's hands trembled harder as she met Sarah's eyes. I saw someone carrying something toward the barn around midnight, something wrapped in plastic, and I saw who it was. The silence in the interview room stretched for several seconds after Rachel's statement. Sarah could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant ringing of telephones in the main office. She kept her expression neutral, though her heart was racing. Who did you see, Rachel? She asked quietly. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. My father. I saw my father carrying something toward the old barn. It was wrapped in plastic, and it was heavy enough that he was struggling with it. Sheriff Webb shifted in his chair. Rachel, are you certain about what you saw? It was 35 years ago, and you were only 9 years old. I'm certain, Rachel said, her voice stronger now. I couldn't sleep that night. It was hot, and the window in the bunkhouse bedroom was open. I got up to get water and saw him through the window, crossing the yard in the moonlight. He was carrying something large, maybe 4 feet long, wrapped in what looked like heavy plastic sheeting. The way he was walking, bent over with the weight of it. The way he kept looking around like he didn't want to be seen. I knew something was wrong. Sarah made notes as Rachel spoke. Did you ask him about it later? I tried. The next morning at breakfast, I asked him what he'd been doing outside so late. He got angry with me, Told me I'd been dreaming, that I should never mention it to anyone. He scared me. I'd never seen him look at me like that before. Rachel wiped at her eyes. 2 days later, when the police were all over the farm searching for the cousins, I thought about telling someone what I'd seen. But I was terrified. My father told me that if I ever said anything about that night, bad things would happen, that people would think our family was involved in something terrible. So you stayed quiet, Sarah said, understanding but not judging. For 35 years, I told myself maybe I really had been dreaming, that I'd imagined it or remembered it wrong. But when I heard on the news yesterday that they'd found those children buried on the farm, I knew. I knew what I'd seen was real, and I knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore. Webb leaned forward. Rachel, your father gave statements to investigators in 1989. He said he was in the bunkhouse all night Saturday, that he and Clayton Wade were there together. Was Clayton there that night? Rachel nodded. Yes, Clayton was there. He was drunk, passed out on his bed by 10 o'clock. He wouldn't have known if my father left. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift. Where's your father now, Rachel? He's still alive, still living in Brennan. He works at Patterson's Hardware on Main Street. Has for the last 20 years. Rachel's voice dropped. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years. We had a falling out over something else, but the real reason is I couldn't look at him anymore without thinking about that night. Sarah exchanged glances with Webb. Raymond Price was still in town, still living his life while 3 children had been buried in the ground. If Rachel's testimony was accurate, he might have been the last person to handle their bodies. Rachel, I need you to understand something, Sarah said carefully. What you saw places your father at the scene with what appears to be evidence related to the children's burial. But it doesn't necessarily mean he killed them. He could have been moving the bodies for someone else, helping to cover up what happened. Do you have any knowledge of who might have been responsible for their deaths? Rachel shook her head. No, I've thought about it for years, played out every possibility in my mind. My father was just a farmhand. He had no connection to those children beyond working on the property. Why would he hurt them? Unless someone else hurt them, Webb said slowly. And your father helped dispose of the evidence. The implication hung in the air. If Raymond Price had buried the children, he'd either killed them himself or been complicit in covering up their murders. Either way, he held answers to questions that had haunted Mercer County for more than 3 decades. We're going to need you to make a formal written statement, Sarah said. Everything you remember about that night, every detail, no matter how small it seems. Can you do that? Rachel nodded. Yes, whatever you need. After Rachel was escorted to another room to work with a stenographer on her statement, Sarah and Webb stood in the hallway outside the interview room. We need to bring Raymond Price in immediately, Sarah said. If Rachel's testimony is accurate, he's either our killer or he knows who is. Webb pulled out his phone. I'll have officers pick him up from the hardware store. But Sarah, we need to tread carefully here. Rachel's testimony is compelling, but it's also the memory of a 9-year-old child from 35 years ago. A good defense attorney will tear it apart, which is why we need physical evidence to corroborate her account. If Raymond buried those children, there might be trace evidence that ties him to the septic tank or the bodies themselves. Sarah felt the familiar rush of a case beginning to break open. We need to get warrants for his home, his vehicle if he still has the same one, anything that might have physical evidence. On it, Webb said, already dialing. What are you going to do? Sarah looked back toward the interview room where Rachel Price sat giving her statement. I'm going to go through every piece of evidence we have with fresh eyes. If Raymond Price was involved in burying those children, there has to be something in the original investigation that points to him. Something we missed the first time around. As Webb walked away to coordinate Raymond's arrest, Sarah returned to the conference room full of case files. She pulled out the folder containing Raymond Price's original statements and interview transcripts from 1989. According to the reports, he'd been a model witness, cooperative and forthcoming. He'd expressed appropriate shock and sadness about the children's disappearance. He'd volunteered to help with searches. He'd passed a polygraph examination. But polygraphs measured stress responses, and psychopaths often pass them easily. And cooperation could be a mask for guilt just as easily as evidence of innocence. Sarah began reading through Raymond's statements line by line, looking for inconsistencies, gaps, anything that might reveal the truth beneath the surface. And as she read, she couldn't shake the image Rachel had described, a man in the moonlight, carrying something heavy and wrapped in plastic, moving through the shadows toward a burial ground that wouldn't be discovered for 35 years. Raymond Price was arrested at 11:47 a.m. while restocking shelves in the plumbing section of Patterson's Hardware. According to the officers who brought him in, he'd offered no resistance, said nothing beyond asking if he could call his wife. His face had gone pale when they told him the arrest was related to the Hartley case, but he'd remained silent during the drive to the station. Sarah watched him through the one-way glass of interview room 1. He was 63 years old, thin and weathered, with gray hair and the rough hands of someone who'd worked manual labor most of his life. He sat very still in his chair, staring at the table in front of him, his expression unreadable. DNA results came back preliminary, Webb said, appearing beside her. It's them. Emma, Jacob, and Sophie Hartley. Dr. Foster is 99% certain based on mitochondrial DNA from Margaret Hartley. Full profile will take a few more days, but we have enough for positive identification. Sarah nodded, still watching Raymond through the glass. Has he asked for a lawyer? Not yet. Said he wanted to talk to us first, that he'd been expecting this for a long time. Webb's expression was grim. Those were his exact words. I've been expecting this. They entered the interview room together. Sarah carried a folder containing Rachel's statement and selected pages from the 1989 investigation. She set it on the table but didn't open it immediately. Raymond looked up at them, his eyes moving from Sarah to Webb and back again. Mr. Price, Sarah began, taking a seat across from him. You've been informed of your rights. You understand you can request an attorney at any time. I understand, Raymond said. His voice was quiet, resigned. But I want to tell you what happened. I've carried it for 35 years, and I'm tired of the wait. Sarah felt a chill run through her. This was it. After 3.5 decades, they were about to learn the truth. She activated the recording device on the table between them. This interview is being recorded. Present are Detective Sarah Chen, Sheriff Marcus Webb, and Raymond Daniel Price. Mr. Price, can you state your full name and date of birth for the record? Raymond complied, his voice steady. Then he looked directly at Sarah, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach tighten. Not defiance or anger, but something worse. Shame so deep it seemed to have hollowed him out from the inside. I didn't kill those children, he said, but I buried them. I helped hide what happened to them, and I've lived with that every day since. Tell us what happened, Sarah said quietly. Raymond took a shaky breath. I was 28 in 1989, working as a farmhand for Thomas Hartley. It was good work, steady pay, and Thomas wasn't a bad boss. But there was something wrong in that house. I could feel it, though I couldn't say what exactly. Patricia was always nervous, always watching Thomas like she was afraid of him. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Sarah remained silent, letting him find his own pace. That Saturday night, August 12th, I was in the bunkhouse with Clayton Wade. We'd been drinking, and Clayton passed out around 10. I was watching some old Western on the TV when I heard a knock on the door. It was after midnight, maybe 12:30. When I opened the door, Thomas Hartley was standing there. Raymond's hands clenched on the table. He looked terrible, pale, shaking. His shirt was dirty. He said there'd been an accident, that he needed my help. Said if I helped him, he'd pay me $10,000. If I didn't, he'd tell the police I'd been stealing from him, that I'd done something terrible. What had happened? Webb asked. He didn't tell me at first. He just said to follow him to the barn and not ask questions. So I did. I needed that job, needed the money. My ex-wife was bleeding me dry in child support, and I couldn't afford to lose my income or go to jail. Raymond's voice cracked. When we got to the barn, I saw them, the 3 children. They were laid out on the barn floor, wrapped in plastic sheeting. All three of them, dead. Sarah kept her voice level, professional, though horror was crawling up her spine. What did Thomas tell you about how they died? He said it was an accident, that he'd been checking on them late at night and Emma had woken up, started screaming at him. Said the other two woke up and started screaming too, that he'd tried to quiet them down but they wouldn't stop. He said he'd just been trying to keep them from waking Patricia, that he'd covered their mouths to muffle the sound, but he'd held on too long. Raymond's eyes filled with tears. He showed me the bags he'd used, cloth bags he'd pulled over their heads. He was crying, saying he never meant for it to happen, that it was an accident. But it wasn't an accident, Sarah said. Raymond met her eyes. No, I don't think it was. The way those children were laid out, all wrapped and tied, it looked too careful, too planned. But I was scared, and I was stupid, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Or maybe I just wanted that money. What did you do with the bodies? Thomas had already dug out that old septic tank, said we'd put them there. We carried them one at a time. I carried Emma. She was so small, so light. His voice broke completely. We put them in that tank and covered it over. Thomas paid me $5,000 that night and $5,000 more a week later. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd kill me and my daughter both. Said he knew where Rachel lived, knew her school, her mother's address. Sarah absorbed this, her mind already working through the implications. Why are you telling us this now? Because Thomas has been dead for 30 years, and I'm dying anyway. Lung cancer. Doctor gave me 6 months, maybe less. Raymond wiped his eyes. I want to die with at least one less sin on my soul. Those children deserved better. Their families deserved to know. Webb leaned forward. Raymond, if Thomas Hartley killed those children, why did he do it? What was his motive? Raymond's face twisted with something between disgust and sorrow. I don't know for sure, but I heard things over the years, rumors about Thomas and young girls, about why Patricia always seemed so afraid. I think those children woke up and saw something they shouldn't have seen. I think Emma knew what her father was, and she couldn't stay quiet anymore. And I think he killed all 3 of them to keep his secret buried. The interview room fell silent except for the faint hum of the recording device. Sarah sat back in her chair, processing everything Raymond had told them. If his account was true, Thomas Hartley had been a predator who'd murdered 3 children to protect himself from exposure, and Raymond Price had helped him hide the evidence for 35 years. Mr. Price, Sarah said finally, you're under arrest for accessory to murder after the fact, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. A formal statement will be prepared based on this interview, and you'll be asked to sign it. Do you understand? I understand, Raymond said. He looked almost relieved. Can I ask you something, Detective? What is it? My daughter, Rachel, she came forward, didn't she? That's how you knew to look at me. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She told us what she saw that night. Raymond closed his eyes, fresh tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. Good. She's a better person than I ever was. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'm so sorry. As officers led Raymond Price back to the holding cells, Sarah and Webb stood alone in the interview room. The weight of what they'd just learned hung heavy between them. Thomas Hartley, Webb said quietly. We investigated him thoroughly in 1989. There was never any indication he was capable of something like this. Predators are good at hiding, Sarah replied, and the dead can't defend themselves against accusations. We need to find corroboration for Raymond's story, medical examiner's report, witness statements, anything that suggests Thomas Hartley was abusing children. Webb nodded slowly. Patricia Hartley. If anyone knew what Thomas was, it would have been her. But she's been dead for 22 years. Then we dig into her past, medical records, therapy records if they exist, friends, family. Someone knew. Someone always knows. Sarah gathered the files from the table. And we need to notify the families. Margaret and David Hartley deserve to know we found their children, and that we know what happened to them. As they left the interview room, Sarah couldn't shake Raymond's description of carrying Emma's small body to her burial place. 3 children who'd trusted the adults around them to keep them safe. 3 children who died because one man couldn't let his darkness be exposed to the light. After 35 years buried in the ground, Emma, Jacob, and Sophie Hartley were finally going to get the justice they deserved. But the truth of what had been done to them was more horrible than anyone had imagined. The house where Patricia Hartley had died sat on a quiet street in Brennan, now occupied by a young family who'd moved in 2 years prior. Sarah stood on the sidewalk outside, studying the modest single-story home with its freshly painted shutters and neatly trimmed lawn. Patricia had lived here alone after Thomas's death in 1993, a self-imposed exile from the farm where her daughter had vanished. Sarah had spent the previous evening tracking down Patricia's medical records, a task that required multiple warrants and phone calls. What she'd found had painted a disturbing picture of a woman who'd lived in constant fear. Emergency room visits for falls and accidents. Going back to 1982, a prescription history that included anxiety medication and sleeping pills, and one notation from a doctor's appointment in 1987 that made Sarah's blood run cold. Patient expressed concerns about daughter's safety, advised counseling. Patient declined, stated husband would not approve. Now Sarah was meeting with Dorothy Hayes, who'd been Patricia's closest friend and neighbor for the last 9 years of Patricia's life. Dorothy was 78 now, a small woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes. She'd agreed to meet Sarah at a coffee shop downtown rather than at her home, saying she didn't want her husband to overhear their conversation. Patricia was a broken woman, Dorothy said, stirring sugar into her coffee. When I first met her in 1993, right after Thomas died, she was like a ghost, haunted by something more than just grief. Did she ever talk about what happened to Emma and the other children? Sarah asked. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Not directly, but there were things she said over the years, especially toward the end when the cancer was taking her. Things that suggested she knew more than she'd told the police. What kind of things? She said once that she should have protected Emma better, that she'd known Thomas had darkness in him, but she'd been too afraid to act. Another time, she told me that the children had died because of her cowardice. Dorothy's hands trembled as she lifted her cup. I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't elaborate, just said that God would judge her for her sins. Sarah leaned forward. Did Patricia ever suggest that Thomas had hurt Emma, or that he'd been inappropriate with her? Dorothy's face tightened. She never said it outright, but yes, I believe that's what she was implying. There was one conversation we had, maybe 6 months before she died. She was on a lot of pain medication by then, and I think it loosened her tongue. She told me that Thomas had needs that weren't natural, that he'd focused those needs on Emma as she got older. She said she'd tried to keep Emma safe by never leaving her alone with Thomas, by sleeping in Emma's room, some nights. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm. Sarah's chest tightened with anger and sorrow for a little girl who'd never had a chance. Did Patricia say what happened the night the children disappeared? She said she'd taken sleeping pills that night because Thomas insisted. Said she woke up Sunday morning and all 3 children were gone. She believed Thomas had done something to them, but she had no proof, and she was too terrified to accuse him. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. She lived with that guilt until the day she died, the guilt of knowing what her husband was and not being strong enough to stop him. Sarah made notes, her handwriting tight and controlled. Is there anything else Patricia told you that might help us understand what happened? Dorothy hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. Patricia gave me this about a week before she died. Said it was a letter she'd written years ago but never sent. She made me promise I'd only give it to the police if they ever found the children's bodies. Said if the children stayed missing, the truth should stay buried too. But if they were found, someone needed to know. Sarah took the envelope with careful hands. Patricia's name was written on the front in faded ink, along with a date, September 1989, just 1 month after the children's disappearance. I've kept it all these years, Dorothy said, Part of me hoped I'd never have to give it to anyone, that those poor children would stay missing and Patricia could rest in peace. But now that they've been found, she deserves to tell her story, even if it's 22 years too late. Sarah opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was shaky, emotional. The words sometimes smudged, as if tears had fallen on the page while it was being written. As Sarah read, the horror of what had happened on the Hartley farm became crystal clear. The letter was Patricia's confession, not of murder, but of complicity through silence. She described years of abuse, of Thomas's obsession with young girls, of her own desperate attempts to protect Emma. She wrote about the sleeping pills Thomas had given her that Saturday night, insisting she needed rest. About waking Sunday morning to find the children gone and Thomas calm, too calm, telling her they must have run away. And then Patricia described something that made Sarah's hands shake. She'd found Emma's pajamas later that week, hidden in the burn barrel behind the barn, partially burned but recognizable. She'd confronted Thomas, and he'd admitted what he'd done. How Emma had woken up and found him in the room with the cousins. How she'd started screaming, threatening to tell, and he'd panicked. How he'd silenced all three of them to protect himself. Patricia had written, "I am a coward, and God will punish me. I should have gone to the police. I should have told them what Thomas confessed to me. But I was afraid of him, and I was afraid of what people would think of me for staying with a monster. So I stayed silent, and those three beautiful children stayed in the ground. Emma, Jacob, Sophie, I am so sorry. Please forgive me for being too weak to give you justice." Sarah finished reading and carefully refolded the letter, placing it back in the envelope. This was the corroboration they needed. Patricia's written confession, given to a friend with instructions to only reveal it if the children were found, would be powerful evidence supporting Raymond Price's testimony. "Thank you for keeping this," Sarah said to Dorothy, "and for coming forward now." Dorothy nodded, wiping her eyes. "Will this help? Will it prove what happened to those children?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Combined with the other evidence we've gathered, this paints a clear picture of what Thomas Hartley did and why. It won't bring those children back, but it will finally give their families the truth." As Sarah left the coffee shop, Patricia's letter secured in an evidence bag, she thought about the woman who'd written it. Patricia Hartley had been a victim too, trapped in an impossible situation by fear and circumstance. But her silence had allowed a killer to escape justice for 35 years. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the cruelest prisons were the ones people built for themselves out of shame and terror. Patricia had lived in that prison until cancer finally released her, and all the while, 3 children had remained in the ground, waiting for someone to be brave enough to speak the truth. Margaret and David Hartley arrived at the Mercer County Sheriff's Department on a gray Thursday morning, driving down from Oklahoma in their aging Honda sedan. Sarah watched them through the window as they parked, 2 people in their 70s moving slowly, carefully, as if the weight of 35 years had settled into their bones. She'd spoken to them by phone 2 days earlier, informing them that their children's remains had been found, and that arrests had been made in connection with their deaths. Margaret had wept on the phone while David had remained silent, his breathing the only sound on his end of the line. Now they were here to learn the full truth of what had happened to Jacob and Sophie. Sarah met them in the lobby. Margaret was small and gray-haired, her face lined with years of grief. David was taller, thin, his eyes holding a hollow look that Sarah recognized from other parents who'd lost children. They looked diminished somehow, as if part of them had died with their son and daughter all those years ago. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartley," Sarah said gently, extending her hand. "Thank you for making the trip. I'm Detective Chen. I know this is incredibly difficult, but I wanted to tell you in person what we've learned about Jacob and Sophie." Margaret's hand trembled in Sarah's. "Are you certain it's them? Are you absolutely certain?" "Yes, ma'am. DNA confirmation came back yesterday. The remains we found are Jacob and Sophie, along with your niece Emma. David's face crumpled. 35 years. They were in the ground for 35 years and we never knew. We were living our lives while they were... Sarah guided them to a private conference room, away from the bustle of the department. She'd prepared coffee and tissues, small comforts for devastating news. Once they were seated, she took her time explaining what the investigation had uncovered, trying to be both truthful and compassionate. She told them about Raymond Price's confession, about his testimony regarding Thomas Hartley's actions. She told them about Patricia's letter, about the years of abuse and fear that had culminated in 3 children's deaths. What she didn't tell them were the most disturbing details about why Thomas had done what he'd done. Some truths were too horrible for parents to bear. Margaret sobbed openly as Sarah spoke, her hands covering her face. David sat frozen beside her, tears streaming silently down his weathered cheeks. When Sarah finished, the silence in the room was broken only by Margaret's weeping. "My brother," David finally said, his voice hoarse. "My own brother murdered our children." "Thomas was deeply troubled," Sarah said carefully. "Patricia's letter suggests she tried to protect Emma, but she was too frightened of him to succeed. I don't think anyone fully understood the danger he posed until it was too late." "We left them there," Margaret said through her tears. "We dropped Jacob and Sophie off for a fun weekend with their cousin, and we drove away. We trusted Thomas. We trusted Patricia. And they died because of it." Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand over Margaret's. "What happened to your children was not your fault. You had no way of knowing what Thomas was capable of. No parent should ever have to imagine that kind of evil." David looked up, his eyes red and haunted. "Did they suffer? Please, I need to know. Did my children suffer?" This was the question Sarah had been dreading. The medical examiner's report had been detailed and disturbing. The children had been suffocated with bags tied over their heads, a method that would have taken several minutes. They would have been conscious, aware, terrified. But parents didn't need to carry that knowledge with them. "The medical examiner believes they died relatively quickly," Sarah said, choosing her words with care. "They were together, all 3 of them. They weren't alone." It was a small comfort, perhaps, but it was all she could offer. Margaret seemed to take solace in it, nodding slowly as she wiped her eyes. "What happens now?" David asked. "To Raymond Price, to the investigation." "Raymond Price will be prosecuted for his role in covering up the murders. He's cooperating fully with the investigation, which will be taken into account. Thomas Hartley can't be prosecuted since he's deceased, but the case will be officially closed with him listed as the perpetrator." Sarah paused. "Your children's remains have been released to the funeral home you specified. You can finally lay them to rest properly." Margaret looked at her husband, and something unspoken passed between them. "We'd like to bury them at home," she said. "In Oklahoma, where we live now, not in Texas. There's nothing but pain for us here." "Of course," Sarah said. "Whatever you need, we'll help arrange." They sat together for a while longer, Sarah answering their questions, filling in the gaps in their knowledge of that terrible night 35 years ago. She showed them photographs of the investigation site, though not the images of the bodies themselves. She gave them copies of the official reports, sanitized of the most graphic details. Before they left, Margaret asked to see Emma's parents' graves. Sarah drove them to the Brennan Cemetery, where Thomas and Patricia Hartley were buried side by side under a simple granite headstone. Margaret stood before the graves for a long time, David's arm around her shoulders. "I forgive Patricia," Margaret finally said. "She was a victim too, in her own way. But Thomas..." She shook her head. "I hope he's burning in hell for what he did to our babies." David remained silent, staring at his brother's name carved into stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold with an anger that had been building for 35 years. "You were my brother. I looked up to you. I trusted you with my children." He paused, his jaw clenching. "I'm glad you're dead. I'm glad you died before you could hurt anyone else. and I hope that wherever you are now, you're being punished for what you did." As they walked back to the car, Margaret turned to Sarah one last time. "Thank you for not giving up, for finding them, for giving us the truth, even though it's terrible. At least now we can stop wondering. We can finally grieve properly and let them rest." Sarah watched them drive away. Two elderly people who'd been given the answer to a question that had haunted them for more than half their lives. The answer hadn't brought peace, exactly, but perhaps it had brought closure. Sometimes that was the best anyone could hope for. Back at the station, Sheriff Webb was waiting with news. "Judge approved the exhumation order for Thomas Hartley's body. Medical examiner wants to do a full autopsy, see if there's any physical evidence that corroborates Patricia's letter." Sarah nodded, though she knew they wouldn't find much after 30 years in the ground. But it was worth trying. Every piece of evidence helped build the case, helped ensure that history would record the truth of what happened. "There's something else," Webb said, his expression troubled. "We've started getting calls from other families, people who had children who disappeared in the 1980s and 90s, asking if we think Thomas Hartley might have been involved. One woman says her daughter vanished from a county fair in 1986, and she remembers seeing Thomas there that day." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "How many calls?" "4 so far, and that's just in the last 24 hours. The implication was clear. Thomas Hartley might not have stopped with Emma, Jacob, and Sophie. There might be other victims, other families who deserved answers. The investigation into 3 children's deaths had just potentially opened into something far larger and more horrifying. "We need to look into every case," Sarah said. "Every missing child from the counties surrounding Brennan between 1980 and Thomas's death in 1993. Cross-reference with Patricia's medical records, places Thomas traveled for work, anywhere he might have had access to children." Webb nodded grimly. "I'll get a team on it. But Sarah, if Thomas Hartley was a serial predator, if there are more victims out there, this is going to get worse before it gets better." Sarah thought about Margaret and David Hartley, about the relief and pain mingled in their faces when they'd learned the truth. Then she thought about other parents, still waiting, still wondering what had happened to their children. If Thomas Hartley had taken more victims, those families deserved the same closure, the same terrible gift of truth. "Then we do the work," she said. "However long it takes, however many victims there are, we find them all. We bring them all home." 3 weeks after the discovery at the Hartley farm, Sarah stood in the basement archive room of the Texas Department of Public Safety, surrounded by boxes of cold case files. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled of old paper and dust. Beside her, a forensic analyst named Marcus Webb Jr., the sheriff's son, was cross-referencing missing persons reports with Thomas Hartley's known locations and timeline. They'd been at it for 5 days straight, and the results were devastating. "I've got another possible match," Marcus said, holding up a yellowed file. "Jessica Moreno, age 9, disappeared from a church carnival in Brewster County, July 1987. Last seen near the parking lot. Thomas Hartley made a farm equipment purchase in that county 3 days before the carnival." Sarah added Jessica's file to the growing stack on the table. It was the 7th potential victim they'd identified. 7 children who'd vanished without a trace in the years before Emma, Jacob, and Sophie's deaths. 7 families who might finally get answers. The pattern that had emerged was chilling in its consistency. Thomas had been careful, never taking children from Mercer County after Emma. He'd traveled regularly for farm business, attending auctions and agricultural fairs across West Texas. And in the communities he'd visited, children had disappeared. Not many, not enough to draw attention to a pattern. One here, one there, spread across years and counties. But when viewed together, the connections were impossible to ignore. Sarah's phone rang and she stepped into the hallway to answer. It was Dr. Foster, the medical examiner. "Detective Chen, I've completed the analysis of Thomas Hartley's exhumed remains. I think you need to come see what we found." An hour later, Sarah stood in the medical examiner's office, looking at photographs spread across Dr. Foster's desk. They showed bones, carefully cleaned and examined, marked with small numbered flags. Thomas Hartley's skeletal remains show evidence of multiple healed fractures, Dr. Foster explained. Ribs, fingers, facial bones. The pattern is consistent with defensive injuries sustained over many years. Someone was fighting back against him regularly. "Patricia," Sarah said quietly. "That would be my assessment, but here's what's interesting." Dr. Foster pulled out another set of photographs. "We also found fabric fibers embedded in his clothing, preserved by the embalming process. The forensic lab analyzed them and found matches to 3 different types of children's clothing from the 1980s. Blue denim, pink cotton, and yellow polyester blend." Sarah's breath caught. Emma was wearing pink when she disappeared. Sophie was in yellow. And Jacob was wearing jeans, Dr. Foster confirmed. These fibers suggest Thomas had close physical contact with all 3 children shortly before or after their deaths. It's further corroboration of Raymond Price's testimony. Sarah thanked him and returned to the archive room, where Marcus had found 2 more potential matches. The weight of it all was becoming overwhelming. 9 missing children. 9 families who'd spent years wondering and waiting. And all of it traced back to one man who'd hidden his darkness behind the respectable facade of a farmer and family man. That evening, Sarah met with Sheriff Webb in his office. The older man looked exhausted, the case taking its toll on him as well. "The DA wants to hold a press conference tomorrow," he said. "Officially announced that we're investigating Thomas Hartley in connection with multiple missing children cases. The media is already running with it." "How are the families handling it?" Sarah asked. Mixed reactions. Some are relieved to finally have a suspect. Others are angry it took this long to make the connections. Margaret Hartley called me this morning. She wanted to know if David's brother might have hurt other children before he killed Jacob and Sophie. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That we're investigating, that we'll follow the evidence wherever it leads." Webb rubbed his eyes. "This case has destroyed so many lives, Sarah, and it's not over yet." Sarah thought about the boxes of files in the archive room, each one representing a child who disappeared, a family torn apart by unanswered questions. "We're going to find them all," she said. "Every victim, every burial site. We owe them that much." Webb nodded slowly. "Rachel Price came to see me yesterday. Raymond's daughter. She wanted to know if her testimony helped catch her father. I told her it did, that she'd been incredibly brave to come forward after all these years." "How is she?" "Struggling, like everyone touched by this case, but she said something that stuck with me. She said that secrets are like poison, that they destroy you from the inside out, and that telling the truth, even when it's painful, is the only way to heal." Sarah understood what Rachel meant. This entire case had been built on secrets. Thomas's secret predation, Patricia's secret knowledge, Raymond's secret complicity, all of it festering in the darkness for 35 years until the earth finally gave up what it had been hiding. The next morning, the press conference drew reporters from across Texas and beyond. Sheriff Webb stood at the podium, Sarah beside him, and announced that Thomas Hartley was being investigated as a suspect in up to 9 missing children cases spanning from 1984 to 1989. He asked anyone with information about Thomas Hartley or the missing children to come forward. Within hours, the tip line was flooded with calls. Some were from people who'd known Thomas, reporting suspicious behavior they'd witnessed but never reported. Others were from families of missing children, desperate to know if their loved ones might finally be found. And still others were from people claiming to have information about burial sites, potential evidence, connections that investigators had missed. Sarah and her team worked through the night, following up on leads, cross-referencing information, slowly building a comprehensive picture of Thomas Hartley's crimes. And with each new piece of evidence, the scope of his predation became clearer. He hadn't just been a man who'd killed his daughter and niece and nephew to protect his secrets. He'd been a serial predator who'd hunted children for years, perhaps even decades. By the end of the week, ground-penetrating radar teams had been dispatched to 3 locations where Thomas had been known to spend time. An old hunting cabin he'd owned in Presidio County, a vacant lot near an agricultural supply warehouse where he'd worked in the early 1980s, and a